He came home from the war expecting his wife's embrace. What he found instead broke his heart. The train rattled into Millbrook Station on a grey October afternoon in 1945, its brakes hissing steam across the empty platform. James Crawford stepped down onto the wooden planks, his army duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his right leg stiff from the shrapnel wound that had earned him an early ticket home. The station was quiet, almost deserted. A handful of civilians hurried past, barely glancing at the man in the wrinkled khaki uniform with the Purple Heart ribbon pinned above his breast pocket. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times in the foxholes of France, in the field hospitals where morphine couldn't quite dull the pain, during the long voyage across the Atlantic when the nightmares came every time he closed his eyes. In those dreams, Sarah would be waiting on this platform, her chestnut hair catching the autumn light, her smile bright as the day he'd married her in the summer of 1942. She'd run to him. He'd drop his bag and catch her, spinning her around despite his wounded leg, breathing in the scent of her perfume, feeling her tears of joy against his neck. But the platform was empty. James adjusted his garrison cap and started walking, his boots echoing hollow against the wood. Maybe she hadn't gotten the telegram. The army had promised to send word 3 days ago when they'd processed his medical discharge at Fort Dix. Maybe the telegram was late. Maybe she was home right now, flour on her hands from baking, the radio playing Glenn Miller, waiting for him without knowing he was so close. The thought warmed him as he limped down Main Street, past Hannigan's drugstore with its faded "Buy War Bonds" poster still hanging in the window, past the shuttered movie theater where they'd seen Casablanca the week before he shipped out. The town looked smaller somehow, tired and worn at the edges, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. 3 years away would do that, he supposed. Or maybe it was him that had changed. The Crawford house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story clapboard with white paint peeling around the windows, and a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. His father had built that porch in 1920. James had proposed to Sarah on those steps in 1941. Every memory of home centered on this house, this street, this life he'd fought to preserve. He stood at the gate for a long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. The curtains were drawn. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the October chill. The front lawn needed mowing, brown leaves gathered in drifts against the foundation. Something felt wrong, but he pushed the thought away and opened the gate. It squeaked, a familiar sound that made his throat tighten. The front door was locked. James knocked, then knocked again, louder. Nothing. He pressed his face to the window, cupping his hands against the glass. The living room was neat but lifeless, furniture covered with white sheets. His mother's mantel clock stopped at 3:20. It looked like nobody had been home in weeks. "She ain't there, son." James spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there anymore. Old Mr. Peterson stood at the property line, rake in hand, his weathered face troubled beneath a flat cap. Mr. Peterson. James crossed the yard, relief flooding through him. Peterson had lived next door since before James was born, had taught him to fish in Miller's Creek, had slipped him cigars on his 18th birthday. "Where's Sarah? Is she all right?" Peterson shifted his weight, not meeting James's eyes. "She's fine, physically speaking, just she ain't here much these days." "What do you mean?" The tightness in James's chest returned, sharper now. "Where is she?" "Working, mostly. Down at the Airbase." Peterson scratched his jaw, clearly uncomfortable. "Started there about 18 months back, maybe longer. She's there near every day now, from what I can tell." "The Airbase?" James felt the world tilt slightly. The county airbase was 10 miles north, a training facility for transport pilots and navigators. Why would Sarah be working at the airbase? Peterson looked at him then, something like pity in his pale blue eyes. "Can't rightly say, James, but she's there. Folks see her around town sometimes, always in a rush, always tired-looking. She keeps to herself these days." He paused, then added quietly, "Your mother's place is empty too. Heard she moved up to Toledo to live with your sister after she got that telegram saying you were wounded. Don't think she could stand being here, waiting for worse news." James nodded slowly, trying to process it all. His mother gone, his house locked and abandoned. His wife working at a military base 10 miles away, surrounded by soldiers, young men with their whole lives ahead of them, not broken and scarred like... He cut off that thought before it could take root. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "I'll head up there to the base." "James." Peterson's hand caught his arm, gentle but firm. "Don't go jumping to conclusions, son. War's been hard on everyone. Things ain't always what they seem." But James was already walking away, his duffel bag forgotten on the porch, his bad leg protesting with every step as he headed back toward Main Street. The airbase. Sarah was at the airbase. Why? They'd never talked about her working, especially not at a military installation. She'd been a schoolteacher before the war, taught 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary, loved it more than anything except him. What could possibly have driven her to leave that, to leave their home, to spend her days surrounded by other men? The thought came unbidden, ugly and unwelcome, but once it arrived it wouldn't leave. James had seen enough in Europe to know what war did to marriages. He'd watched men open letters from home with shaking hands, had held Johnny Martinez while he sobbed after reading that his fiancée had married a 4F factory worker, had found Tommy Chen with his service revolver in his mouth after a Dear John letter arrived the day before the Battle of the Bulge. He'd told himself his marriage was different. Sarah loved him. They'd promised each other forever. She wore his grandmother's ring and kept his photograph by the bed and wrote him letters full of everyday details that made him remember why he was fighting. But he'd been gone 3 years. 3 years of silence, broken only by censored letters that took weeks to arrive. 3 years of her alone in that house, wondering if he'd come home in a coffin instead of alive. 3 years was a long time. James caught a ride with a farmer hauling apples to the base commissary, sitting in the back of the truck among the crates, barely noticing the bruises the bumpy road left on his shoulders. The farmer tried to make conversation, but gave up after a few miles, leaving James alone with his thoughts and the growing dread in his stomach. The airbase sprawled across the flat farmland like a small city. Quonset huts arranged in precise rows, concrete runways stretching toward the horizon, the control tower rising above it all like a sentinel. C-47 transport planes sat in neat lines, their propellers still, crews working beneath their wings. Jeeps and trucks moved along the internal roads, soldiers walking in pairs and groups, everything organized with military efficiency. James showed his discharge papers at the main gate. The MP, a kid who looked about 19, waved him through without much interest. "Canteen straight ahead, past the motor pool," he said. "Can't miss it." The canteen was a large Quonset hut with windows along both sides and smoke rising from a chimney. James could hear voices inside, laughter, the clatter of dishes, the Andrews sisters singing "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree" on a jukebox. He stood outside for a long moment, his hand on the door handle, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. This was it. Whatever waited inside would either confirm his worst fears or prove him a fool for doubting. He thought of Sarah's face the last time he'd seen her, standing on the train platform in 1942, crying but trying to smile, promising to wait, promising to love him through whatever came. He thought of her letters, dozens of them, carefully preserved in his duffel bag back on the porch, each one signed, "Forever yours, Sarah." James pushed open the door. The warmth hit him first, thick with the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke and something baking. The canteen was crowded, mostly young soldiers in training fatigues, sitting at long wooden tables or standing in groups near the serving counter. A jukebox glowed in the corner. Someone was dealing cards at a table near the window. The whole scene reminded him of a dozen similar canteens he'd visited in England and France, these spaces where soldiers tried to forget the war for an hour, tried to pretend they were just regular boys doing regular things. And then he saw her, Sarah stood behind the serving counter, pouring coffee into a white mug held by a young private. She wore a simple brown dress with a white apron, her chestnut hair pinned back with bobby pins, her face tired but animated as she said something that made the private laugh. She looked thinner than James remembered, shadows under her eyes, but still beautiful, still his Sarah, except she wasn't acting like his Sarah. James watched from the doorway as she handed the private his coffee, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. The kid said something else, and she smiled, that gentle smile James had fallen in love with 7 years ago at a church social. She turned to serve the next soldier in line, a corporal with a Kansas drawl who called her ma'am and asked about the pie. Sarah cut him a generous slice, slid it across the counter, accepted his thanks with another smile. She was good at this, James realized. Natural. The soldiers clearly liked her, felt comfortable around her. She moved among them with easy confidence, topping off coffee cups, clearing plates, laughing at their jokes, offering what looked like motherly advice to a homesick-looking kid at the end of the counter. And James felt something dark and cold spreading through his chest. He'd spent 3 years dreaming of home, of Sarah, of the life they'd built together after the war. He'd earned his Purple Heart and his early discharge by taking German shrapnel meant for his squad. He'd watched friends die, had killed men whose faces still haunted him, had survived hell itself with the thought of her waiting for him, the only thing keeping him sane. And here she was, serving coffee to fresh-faced kids who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, smiling at them, touching their hands, looking more alive than she ever had in her letters. A sergeant at a nearby table noticed James standing in the doorway. "Help you, soldier. You lost." The question drew attention. Several heads turned, and then, inevitably, Sarah looked toward the door. Their eyes met across the crowded canteen. James watched her face go through a series of changes: confusion, shock, recognition, something that might have been joy or might have been fear. He couldn't tell which. The coffee pot in her hand tilted, and dark liquid splashed across the counter. She didn't seem to notice. James. His name came out as barely a whisper, but in the sudden quiet of the canteen, everyone heard it. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to run. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to pretend he'd never come here, never seen this. Instead, he just stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of dozens of stairs, feeling his carefully constructed dreams crumbling like old paper in his hands. Sarah set down the coffee pot with shaking hands and started to come around the counter, but James turned and walked out. He heard her call his name again, louder this time, desperate. He heard the door bang open behind him. But he kept walking, past the motor pool, past the neat rows of Quonset huts, past everything, his bad legs screaming with every step, his vision blurring with tears he refused to shed. He'd come home expecting her embrace. What he'd found instead was something he didn't understand, something that made his chest feel hollow and his hands shake with emotions he couldn't name. Behind him, Sarah's voice called out one more time. "James, please, let me explain." But what explanation could possibly make sense of what he'd just seen? James made it as far as the hangar row before his leg gave out. He leaned against the corrugated metal wall of a maintenance building, breathing hard, his vision swimming with pain and something worse than pain. The October wind cut through his uniform, carrying the smell of engine oil and aviation fuel, sounds of distant propellers warming up for afternoon training runs. Everything felt too sharp, too real, like his senses had been turned up to a volume he couldn't handle anymore. "James!" Sarah's voice carried across the tarmac, closer now. He could hear her footsteps running, quick and light despite the gravel. Part of him wanted to keep moving, to disappear into the maze of buildings and never look back. But his leg wouldn't cooperate, and somewhere beneath the anger and confusion and hurt, a deeper part of him, the part that had loved her first, loved her longest, wanted answers. She came around the corner of the building, slightly out of breath, her apron flapping in the wind. She'd thrown a cardigan over her dress but hadn't bothered to button it. Her hair had come loose from its pins, falling across her face in the way that used to make his heart skip. Even now, even angry and hurt and betrayed, he noticed these things, noticed her. "James." She stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting together, her eyes searching his face. "You're home. You're really home. Apparently." The word came out harsher than he intended, but he didn't take it back, though I'm starting to wonder if I should have bothered. The hurt that flashed across her face was unmistakable, but it only made him angrier. She didn't get to be hurt. She wasn't the one who'd come home to an empty house, to neighbors who looked at her with pity, to finding her wife serving coffee to a building full of young soldiers like she belonged there more than she belonged with him. "I can explain," Sarah said, taking a small step forward. "If you'll just listen." "Explain what?" James pushed himself away from the wall, standing as straight as his wounded leg would allow. "Explain why you're working at a military base instead of teaching. Explain why our house is locked up like nobody lives there. Explain why Mr. Peterson looks at me like I'm about to hear the worst news of my life. It's not what you think. You don't know what I think." The words exploded out of him, louder than he meant, echoing off the metal buildings. A pair of mechanics working on a nearby jeep looked over, curious, and James lowered his voice. 3 years, Sarah. 3 years I was gone. 3 years of wondering if I'd ever see you again. And I come home to find you, what, playing house with a bunch of kids in uniform. That's not fair." Sarah's own voice had an edge now, tears starting to gather in her eyes. "You don't understand what it's been like. You don't know? Then tell me." James spread his hands, a gesture of frustration and pleading. "Tell me why my wife is spending her days serving coffee to soldiers instead of being home where she belongs. Tell me something that makes sense, Sarah, because right now nothing does." Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at her hands, at the plain gold band on her left finger that matched the one James still wore. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, steadier. "I took this job 18 months ago," she said. After they told me you were wounded. After the telegram came, saying you were in a field hospital in France and they didn't know if you'd make it." James felt something twist in his chest. He remembered that wound, remembered the explosion that had torn through their position during the push toward Germany, remembered waking up in the hospital tent with his leg on fire and a chaplain standing over him looking too serious. "The school let me go," Sarah continued, her voice catching. "Said they needed someone who could give the children their full attention, not someone who spent every class period staring out the window, waiting for another telegram. They were kind about it, gave me 2 weeks' pay and a letter of reference. But I was done teaching. So you came here." James couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "To an airbase full of men. I came here because I needed a job." Sarah's eyes flashed, something of her old fire showing through. "Because the army stopped your pay when you got wounded, did you know that? Stopped it for 3 months while they processed your medical status. 3 months, James. The mortgage was due, the utilities were due, I had to eat, I had to survive, while waiting to find out if my husband was going to live or die." James stared at her. "The army stopped my pay? For 3 months." Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing away tears. "I went through our savings in 6 weeks. Sold my mother's silver to make the mortgage. Started skipping meals. And then Mrs. Henderson at the church told me they were hiring at the Airbase canteen, civilian positions, no questions asked. So I did. What else was I supposed to do?" The wind gusted between them, carrying the sound of a transport plane taking off. James felt the anger in his chest, struggling against something else now, something that might have been shame or understanding, or the horrible realization that he'd jumped to the worst possible conclusion. "You could have written to me," he said, but the words sounded weak, even to his own ears. "And say what?" Sarah's voice broke. "Dear James, I hope you're not dead by the way I'm working at an airbase because the army forgot to pay you. How was I supposed to add to your burdens when you were fighting and bleeding and I didn't even know if my letters were reaching you? She had a point. James had gotten her letters irregularly at best, sometimes 3 or 4 arriving in a bunch after weeks of nothing. He'd written back when he could, but he knew his own letters had been just as sporadic. "The house," he said. "Why isn't anyone living in the house?" Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "I couldn't afford to keep it. Your mother went to Toledo. I moved into a boarding house on 2nd Street, Mrs. Murphy's place. It's closer to the base pickup, and the rent's cheaper. I was going to write to you about it, but then what? Then the letters stopped coming." Sarah looked at him fully now, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. "For 4 months, James. 4 months of nothing. No letters, no telegrams, no word at all. I wrote to the War Department twice. They told me you were alive, but couldn't give me any other information. I thought maybe you were captured, wounded again, or..." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. James remembered those 4 months after the Battle of the Bulge, the chaos, the reorganizations, the push into Germany that left no time for letters home. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have written more. And I should have found a way to tell you about the job, about the house." Sarah took another step closer. "But I was scared, James. Scared you'd think exactly what you're thinking now. Scared you'd come home and see me working around all these soldiers and assume I'd forgotten you." The words hung between them, honest and painful. James wanted to deny it, but he had thought those things, couldn't quite shake the image of her smiling at that private. "I saw you in there," James said quietly. "Saw you laughing with them, comfortable with them. You looked happy." "I was being professional." Sarah's voice had a pleading edge now. "James, those boys are scared. Most of them have never been away from home. They're about to ship out to places where people are trying to kill them. The least I can do is pour them a cup of coffee with a smile, make them feel like someone cares. Like you cared about me. I never stopped caring about you." The force of her words startled them both. "Never. Not for one single day. Every dollar I made went into an envelope in my room. Every shift I worked was another step toward getting our life back. You think I enjoyed this? You think I wanted to spend my days in that canteen instead of in our house, waiting for you to come home?" James felt his anger crumbling. "Then why did you look so comfortable?" "Because I'm good at pretending," Sarah's voice cracked. "Because I learned to smile when I wanted to scream, to laugh when I wanted to cry, to act like everything was fine when my whole world was falling apart. That's what we did, James. All of us wives and mothers and sisters, we pretended to be strong because if we weren't strong, if we fell apart, then what good were we to anyone?" She was sobbing now, and before James could think, he moved forward and caught her. She collapsed against his chest, her hands clutching his uniform, her tears soaking through the khaki fabric. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling how thin she'd gotten, feeling the way she trembled like something that had been holding itself together too long and finally broke. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you everything. I should have trusted you," James said, his voice rough. "Should have known better." They stood there in the shadow of the maintenance hangar, holding each other while the wind blew cold around them, and somewhere overhead another plane took off. James rested his chin on top of Sarah's head, breathing in the scent of her hair. Different soap than she used to use, cheaper probably, but still somehow Sarah underneath it all. "Come home with me," he said. "We'll figure out the rest." Sarah pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "I can't, not yet." "What do you mean?" "My shift doesn't end until 6. If I leave now, they'll dock my pay, maybe fire me." She wiped at her eyes. "I need this job, James. At least until we figure out what comes next. The boarding house rent is due next week. We need to buy food, figure out what to do about the house." "I don't care about the money." "Well, I do." Sarah's voice was firmer now, the schoolteacher tone he remembered. "We have to be practical." "Sarah." She stopped, looking at him. "I love you," James said. "I came home for you. Everything else, we'll figure it out together. But I need you to know that. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling now, really smiling. "I love you too." I never stopped, not for 1 second. They kissed then, and for a moment James forgot about the canteen and the soldiers and his own stupid jealousy. For a moment it was just them, just Sarah and James, just the two people who'd promised forever to each other. When they pulled apart, Sarah glanced back toward the canteen. "I really do have to finish my shift, but wait for me, please. We can ride back to town together, talk properly." James wanted to argue, but he saw the practicality in her eyes, the same practicality that had kept her alive and fed while he was gone. "I'll wait." "Where?" "There's a bench by the operations building, the one with the flower boxes Mrs. Henderson planted. Nobody bothers you there. 6 o'clock sharp." She squeezed his hand once more, then hurried back toward the canteen. James watched her go, watched her disappear through the door. But it looked different now. She looked different. Not like she belonged there more than with him, but like she was doing what she had to do, surviving the only way she knew how. James found the bench, sat down despite the cold, and pulled out a cigarette. His hands shook slightly as he lit it. He'd been so certain when he walked into that canteen, so certain of betrayal. But now he realized how little he knew about Sarah's war. He'd been so focused on his own battles that he'd never really considered what she'd been fighting. A sergeant walked past, nodded at James's Purple Heart ribbon. "Welcome home, soldier." "Thanks," James said automatically. But as he sat there smoking and waiting for 6 o'clock, he wondered if he'd really come home at all. Or if home was something they'd both have to rebuild together, piece by piece, truth by truth. What he'd discovered today wasn't betrayal. It was something more complicated, more painful, and somehow more real. And the worst part was, he had a feeling there was more to the story, more that Sarah hadn't told him yet. The question was whether he was ready to hear it. The October sun was sinking behind the hangar buildings when Sarah finally emerged from the canteen. Her cardigan pulled tight against the evening chill, her face shadowed with exhaustion. James had been sitting on that bench for nearly 2 hours, watching the airbase wind down its daily operations. Pilots returning from training runs, ground crews securing aircraft for the night, soldiers heading to the mess hall for dinner. The whole base had a rhythm to it, a choreographed dance of military life that James recognized from his own years in uniform, but it all felt alien now, watching from the outside. Sarah spotted him and raised her hand in a small wave. Even from a distance, James could see how tired she was, the way her shoulders sagged, the slowness of her steps. She walked like someone who'd been on her feet too long, doing too much, for too many months. "Ready?" she asked when she reached him, her voice carefully neutral, like she wasn't sure if their earlier reconciliation still held or if he'd spent the last 2 hours rebuilding his anger. James stood, testing his bad leg. The cold hadn't done it any favors. "Ready. How do we get back to town?" "Supply truck leaves in 10 minutes from the motor pool. They make runs to town every evening, dropping off civilians who work on base." Sarah started walking, and James fell into step beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "It's not fancy, but it beats walking 10 miles. They walked in silence past the operations building, past rows of parked jeeps and staff cars, past a group of young airmen smoking and joking near a Quonset hut. A few of them called out to Sarah, friendly greetings, nothing inappropriate, but enough to make James's jaw tighten. She waved back, but didn't stop, didn't engage beyond a quick, "Good night, boys." The supply truck was already idling when they reached it, a canvas-covered deuce-and-a-half with wooden benches in the back. 3 other women were already seated, middle-aged, worn-looking, dressed in similar simple work clothes. They nodded at Sarah, glanced curiously at James, but said nothing. The driver, a corporal with grease stains on his uniform, helped Sarah climb up into the back, then offered James a hand he didn't need, but accepted anyway. "You're Crawford, right?" the corporal said, eyeing James's Purple Heart ribbon. "Heard you were back. Welcome home, sir." "Thanks," James said, wondering how word had spread so fast. But military bases were like small towns. Everyone knew everyone else's business within hours. The truck lurched into motion, heading toward the main gate. Sarah sat beside James on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. The other women talked quietly among themselves about shift schedules and ration coupons, and someone's son who'd just shipped out to the Pacific. Normal conversation, tired women at the end of a long day. But nothing felt normal. The truck dropped them on Main Street as the last light faded from the sky. The other women dispersed quickly, heading to their own homes, their own lives. Sarah and James stood on the sidewalk outside Hannigan's drugstore, the same spot where he'd stood that morning feeling lost and confused. It felt like a lifetime ago. "The boarding house is this way," Sarah said, pointing east toward 2nd Street. "It's not much, but Mrs. Murphy keeps it clean and the other tenants are quiet." "Show me," James said. They walked through the gathering darkness, past houses with lights glowing warm in windows, past the closed library and the shuttered Five and Dime. Millbrook was settling in for the evening. Families gathering for dinner, radios playing news and music, the ordinary rhythms of small-town life continuing as they had throughout the war, throughout everything. Mrs. Murphy's boarding house was a large Victorian that had seen better days, its paint faded and its porch sagging slightly. A hand-lettered sign in the window advertised clean rooms, fair rates, no men after 8 p.m. Sarah led James up the front steps and through the door into a narrow hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood. "Mrs. Murphy," Sarah called out. A stout woman with grey hair emerged from a room at the back, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked James up and down, taking in his uniform and his Purple Heart ribbon, and her stern expression softened slightly. "So you're the husband," she said. "Sarah's been pining for you long enough. Go on up, dear. I'll make an exception to the rule tonight, seeing as he just got home from the war." "Thank you, Mrs. Murphy," Sarah said quietly. Her room was on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the left. Sarah unlocked it with a key she kept on a string around her neck, and they stepped inside. It was tiny. A narrow bed, a small dresser, a wooden chair by the window, a hot plate on a corner table. That was it. No pictures on the walls, no decorations, nothing personal except a framed photograph of their wedding day sitting on the dresser and a battered suitcase under the bed. The room felt temporary, like a place someone was passing through rather than living in. "This is it," Sarah said, a defensive edge in her voice. "Like I said, it's not much." James looked around slowly, taking it all in. The threadbare curtains, the crack in the plaster wall, the single thin blanket on the bed. This was where his wife had been living for months, maybe longer. This cramped, cold little room with barely enough space to turn around. Meanwhile, he'd been imagining her safe and comfortable in their house, maybe teaching at the school, maybe tending her victory garden, living the life they'd planned. The disconnect between his imagination and reality hit him like a physical blow. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough, "why didn't you tell me? In your letters you never said—" "What was I supposed to say?" Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "That I was living in a boarding house and working at a military base while you were getting shot at. That I'd lost our home and my job and didn't know if you were alive or dead. What would that have accomplished except making you worry more? I had a right to know." "Did you?" She turned to face him, and there was something fierce in her expression now, something that went beyond tiredness or hurt. "Did you really? What could you have done from France or Germany? How would knowing have helped anything except add to your burden? You're my wife. Your burdens are my burdens. Not when you're in a foxhole, they're not." Sarah's voice was flat, factual. "Not when you're fighting to stay alive. The last thing you needed was more worry, more guilt, more reasons to lose focus. So I handled it. I handled everything. Alone." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with resentment and pride, and something that might have been accusation. James moved closer to her, his bad leg aching. "You shouldn't have had to handle it alone." "But I did." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because that's what we did, James. All of us wives and mothers and sisters. We handled things. We kept going. We pretended everything was fine so you boys could focus on coming home alive. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "I'm sorry the army stopped my pay. I'm sorry you lost your job. I'm sorry you ended up here in this room working at that base. I'm sorry for all of it." "It's not your fault." Sarah wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for crying. "None of it is your fault. It's just what war does. It breaks things, people, homes, lives, and then we're all left trying to pick up the pieces and pretend they fit back together the same way." James reached for her, and this time she didn't pull away. He wrapped his arms around her and felt her lean into him, felt the tension in her body slowly release as she let herself be held. "I was so scared," she whispered against his chest. "Every day, James. Every single day I was scared. Scared you'd be killed. Scared I'd get a telegram with the worst news. Scared I'd lose everything and have nothing left to hold on to. The job at the base, it was the only thing that kept me sane. Being around soldiers, serving them coffee, hearing their stories, it made me feel closer to you somehow. Like I was still part of your world, even though you were thousands of miles away." "I understand," James said, and he did. Finally, he did. They stood there in that cramped room while full darkness fell outside and Mrs. Murphy's boarding house settled into its nightly quiet. James could hear voices from other rooms, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of a radio playing swing music. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of life continuing despite everything. "There's something else," Sarah said after a long moment. "Something I need to tell you." James felt his stomach tighten. "What?" She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "The money I've been saving, the money from my job at the base, it's not just for us. I've been sending some of it to your mother in Toledo. She couldn't afford to stay in the house after you were wounded, couldn't handle being alone with her fear. The money I sent helped her pay rent, buy food, manage. You've been supporting my mother?" James felt something shift in his chest. "On what you make at the canteen. What else was I supposed to do? She's your mother, James. She was falling apart. Someone had to help." Sarah's voice was defensive again, like she expected him to be angry about this too. But he wasn't angry. He was humbled. "And there's more," Sarah continued, the words coming faster now, like she needed to get them all out before she lost her nerve. "Some of the other women at the canteen, they're war widows. Their husbands were killed in action, and they have children to feed. I've been helping them too when I can. Not much, just a few dollars here and there, enough to make a difference." "Sarah, and Mrs. Henderson at the church, she organizes care packages for soldiers overseas. I've been contributing to those too, sending socks and cigarettes and letters to boys who don't have anyone writing to them. Because I know what it meant to you, getting mail, and I thought if I couldn't write to you as often as I wanted, at least I could help other boys get something from home." She was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face in the dim light from the single lamp. "So when you saw me at the canteen today, laughing and serving coffee, you didn't see the whole picture. You didn't see the nights I cried myself to sleep. You didn't see the meals I skipped so I could send money to your mother. You didn't see the extra shifts I took so I could help those widows. You only saw the smile I put on, the front I showed the world, and you judged me for it. I'm sorry." James pulled her close again, his own eyes burning. "God, Sarah, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong." "I love you," she said fiercely. "I have always loved you. Every choice I made, every sacrifice, every smile and every tear, it was all for you, for us, for the life I kept believing we'd have again." "I know," James said. "I know that now." They held each other while the night deepened outside, while the boarding house grew quiet, while somewhere in the distance a train whistle blew mournful and long. James thought about all the assumptions he'd made, all the judgments he'd passed, all the ways he'd been so completely, utterly wrong. He'd come home expecting to find everything unchanged, preserved in amber like his memories. Instead, he'd found a wife who'd fought her own war, made her own sacrifices, carried burdens he'd never imagined. And somehow, impossibly, she'd survived it all and still loved him. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly. "Now?" James kissed the top of her head. "Now we figure it out together. No more secrets. No more handling things alone. We're a team, Sarah. We always were. I just forgot that for a while." She looked up at him, her face tear-streaked but hopeful. "Together?" "Together," he promised. But even as he said it, even as he held her close and felt the rightness of being with her again, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. More truths waiting beneath the surface. More pieces of Sarah's war that he didn't yet understand, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what else he might learn. Chapter 4. The Hidden Truth. Morning came too early. Pale grey light filtering through the thin curtains of Sarah's room at the boarding house. James woke on the narrow bed, his body stiff and aching, his bad leg throbbing from yesterday's exertion. Sarah was already up, dressed in a different simple dress, pinning her hair back in front of the small mirror above the dresser. She moved quietly, efficiently, like someone who'd learned to get ready in silence so as not to disturb the other tenants. "What time is it?" James asked, his voice rough with sleep. 5:30. Sarah glanced at him in the mirror. "The supply truck leaves at 6:15. I need to be ready." James sat up, pushing aside the thin blanket. "You're going back to the base?" "It's Thursday. I work Thursdays." Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something careful in it, like she was bracing for another argument. "Can't you take a day off? I just got home." "I know." She turned to face him, her expression apologetic but firm. "But like I said yesterday, we need the money, and Mrs. Henderson is counting on me. She's short-staffed as it is." James wanted to argue, wanted to insist she stay, that they spend the day together figuring out their future. But he could see the resolve in her eyes, the same practical determination that had kept her going through the worst of the war. She wasn't being stubborn. She was being responsible. "All right," he said finally. "But I'm coming with you." "To the base?" Sarah looked surprised. "Why?" "Because I want to understand." James stood, testing his leg. "I want to see what you do, see who these people are that you work with. I want to know your life, Sarah. All of it." Something softened in her expression. "Okay, but you'll have to wait in the canteen. I can't have you following me around while I'm working. It wouldn't be appropriate." "I'll behave," James promised. They made the trek to the base in the pre-dawn darkness, sharing the back of the supply truck with the same tired-looking women from the night before. Nobody spoke much. It was too early, and they'd all made this journey too many times for small talk. Sarah sat close to James, her shoulder pressed against his, her fingers occasionally brushing his hand, like she needed the reminder that he was real, that he was here. The airbase was already humming with activity when they arrived. Pilots preparing for dawn training flights, ground crews running pre-flight checks, the sound of engines warming up across the tarmac. James followed Sarah to the canteen, where she immediately tied on her apron and got to work preparing for the breakfast rush. "Coffee's in that urn," she told him, pointing to a corner near the jukebox. "Help yourself. Just try to stay out of the way." James poured himself a cup and found a seat at a table near the window where he could watch without being obvious about it. Within 15 minutes, the canteen began filling with soldiers, young men in training fatigues, rubbing sleep from their eyes, joking with each other in the easy way of boys who haven't seen real combat yet. They lined up at the counter where Sarah and 2 other women served scrambled eggs, toast, bacon when it was available, and endless cups of coffee. And James watched his wife work. She was good at it, he had to admit. Quick and efficient, but never rushed. She remembered names, asked about training exercises, laughed at jokes that probably weren't very funny, but made the soldiers feel clever anyway. There was a warmth to her that went beyond professional courtesy, genuine care, genuine interest in these young men who were about to go off to war. But it was the way they looked at her that caught James's attention. Not with disrespect or inappropriate interest, but with something closer to gratitude, like she represented something they were fighting for, something worth coming home to. She was everybody's girl back home, everybody's sweetheart, everybody's reason to survive. "That's Mrs. Crawford," James heard one soldier say to another. "She's swell. Always has a kind word, you know. Makes you feel like someone actually cares if you make it through training." "Her husband's overseas," the other soldier replied. "Or he was. Heard he got wounded pretty bad." "Poor dame. She's been here over a year, working like crazy. Henderson says she sends half her pay to war widows and orphans." James's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "No kidding," the first soldier said. "That's rough. She works this hard and gives away half of what she makes?" "That's what I heard. Henderson says Mrs. Crawford's one of the best things that ever happened to this base. Morale's way up since she started. The boys shipping out, they feel better knowing someone like her is pulling for them." The soldiers moved away, their conversation shifting to complaints about their training sergeant. But James sat frozen, his mind racing. Half her pay. Sarah had been giving away half of what she made, on top of sending money to his mother, on top of contributing to care packages, on top of everything else. How much had she been living on? How had she survived? He looked at her again, really looked at her. The thinness he'd noticed yesterday made sense now. The shadows under her eyes. The worn-out shoes she wore. She wasn't just working to support herself. She was working to support everyone around her, sacrificing her own needs for others, giving away everything she had, because that's who she was. That's who she'd always been. James felt something break open in his chest, something that hurt and humbled and shamed him all at once. Around 10 o'clock, there was a lull in the breakfast rush. Sarah wiped down the counter and came over to James's table, sliding into the seat across from him. "You're still here," she said, smiling slightly. "Where else would I be?" "I don't know. Bored, maybe. It's not exactly exciting watching people serve eggs." She glanced around the canteen, then back at him. "What do you think?" "I think you're incredible," James said honestly. "I think I had no idea what you've been doing, what you've been giving. I heard some soldiers talking about you, about how you give away half your pay to war widows." Sarah's expression shifted, became guarded. "They shouldn't be talking about that." "Why not? You should be proud. What you're doing." "It's not about pride." Sarah's voice was quiet, but firm. "It's about doing what's right. Those women lost their husbands, James. They have children to feed and no income. The military death benefits don't come through for months sometimes, and in the meantime, they're desperate. If I can help, even a little, why wouldn't I?" "Because you're barely surviving yourself," James said. "That room at the boarding house, the way you're living. Sarah, you can't keep giving everything away." "Why not?" She met his eyes. "You gave everything. You went to war, got wounded, risked your life. Why is your sacrifice more valid than mine?" The question hung between them, unanswerable. Before James could respond, the canteen door opened and a woman walked in, mid-50s, grey hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a navy blue dress with a Red Cross pin on the collar. She had the bearing of someone used to being in charge, and when she spotted Sarah, her face lit up. "Sarah, there you are. I've been looking for you." The woman crossed to their table, then noticed James. "Oh, you must be the husband. James, isn't it? I'm Dorothy Henderson. I run the volunteer coordination for this base." James stood, shaking her offered hand. "Ma'am, sit, sit." Mrs. Henderson waved him back down, then turned to Sarah. "I need to talk to you about the care package initiative. We've received a request from a unit stationed in the Philippines. They're desperate for medical supplies, socks, writing paper, anything we can send. I know it's a lot to ask, but..." "Of course," Sarah said immediately. "I can organize another collection drive. Talk to the churches, the women's auxiliary." "Sarah," James interrupted, "maybe you should rest. You're already doing so much." Mrs. Henderson looked at him, then at Sarah, and something knowing passed across her face. "He doesn't know, does he?" "Know what?" James asked. Sarah's expression tightened. "Mrs. Henderson, he should know, dear. He's your husband. He deserves to know what you've been doing." Mrs. Henderson settled into a chair, fixing James with a direct look. "Your wife has been the backbone of our relief efforts for the past year. The care packages, the fundraising for war widows, the letter-writing campaigns for soldiers who don't have family. Sarah's organized or contributed to all of it. She works 40-hour weeks in this canteen, then spends her evenings coordinating volunteer efforts. Last month alone, she helped us send over 200 care packages overseas." James stared at Sarah. 200? "It's not just me," Sarah protested. "There are dozens of volunteers. Who you organize, motivate and lead," Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "Don't be modest, dear. It doesn't suit you." She turned back to James. "Your wife is the reason morale on this base is as high as it is. The soldiers here, they see her dedication, and it reminds them what they're fighting for. The wives and mothers in town, they see her example and find strength to keep going. She's been a light in very dark times." Sarah's face had gone red. "Mrs. Henderson, please." "And she's done all of it while living in a boarding house and sending money to your mother and half a dozen war widows." Mrs. Henderson's voice was gentle but pointed. "I tried to tell her to slow down, to take care of herself, but she wouldn't hear it. Said she had to keep busy, had to keep useful, or she'd go crazy worrying about you." The words hit James like artillery fire. He looked at Sarah, seeing her fully for perhaps the first time since he'd come home. Not the wife he'd left behind, not the woman he'd imagined waiting patiently in their comfortable home, but someone who'd been transformed by the war just as much as he had. Someone who'd found purpose in service, strength in sacrifice, identity in helping others survive. She'd become a soldier in her own right, not with a rifle, but with coffee and kindness and relentless, exhausting compassion. "I need to get back to work," Sarah said quietly, standing. "Mrs. Henderson, I'll come by your office this afternoon to discuss the care packages." "Thank you, dear." Mrs. Henderson stood as well, patting Sarah's arm. "And James, your wife is a remarkable woman. I hope you know that." "I do," James said, his voice thick. "I'm beginning to." After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah busied herself wiping down tables that were already clean, avoiding James's eyes. He watched her for a moment, then stood and crossed to where she was working. "Sarah, stop." She kept wiping. "I need to keep the tables clean. The lunch rush will start soon." "Sarah." He caught her hand, stilling it. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, and he saw the vulnerability there. The fear that he'd judge her again, find her somehow lacking or wrong. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why all of this? The care packages, the widows, the endless work. Why?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because I had to do something. I couldn't just sit in that boarding house room waiting for news, going crazy with worry. I needed to feel useful. Needed to feel like I was contributing to the war effort, even though I couldn't carry a rifle or fly a plane. And those women, James, the widows, the mothers who lost sons, they needed help so badly. How could I not help when I had the ability to, even if it meant you went hungry, even if it meant you had nothing left for yourself? I had enough." Sarah pulled her hand free, wrapping her arms around herself. "I always had enough. More than enough, really, because at least I still had hope. At least my husband was still alive. Those other women, they'd gotten the worst telegram, the one that ends everything. The least I could do was help them survive it." James felt tears burning in his own eyes. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." "I'm not brave. I'm just—" "You are." He pulled her close despite her resistance, despite the fact that they were standing in the middle of the canteen with soldiers starting to filter in for early lunch. You're the bravest, strongest, most incredible person I know. And I'm sorry I didn't see it yesterday. I'm sorry I doubted you even for a second." Sarah buried her face against his chest, her shoulders shaking. "I was so scared you wouldn't understand. So scared you'd think I'd changed too much, become someone you didn't recognize." "You have changed," James said honestly. "But so have I. We're both different people than we were 3 years ago. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what surviving a war means. We become whoever we need to be to get through it." She pulled back, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "So what do we do now? How do we figure out who we are together if we're both different people?" "Same way we figured it out the first time," James said. "One day at a time, one truth at a time. No more secrets, no more assumptions. Just honesty, even when it's hard." Sarah nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. "Okay, honesty. I can do that." "Good. Then, honestly, when does your shift end? Because I'd like to take my wife out for dinner if she'll let me. Somewhere nice where someone else does the serving for once." A small smile broke through Sarah's tears. "My shift ends at 5, and I'd like that. I'd like that very much." As Sarah returned to work and James settled back at his table, he realized something fundamental had shifted between them. The hurt and confusion and jealousy from yesterday had burned away, leaving something clearer, truer. They weren't the same people who'd said goodbye at the train station in 1942, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something even stronger with the people they'd become. The question was whether they could learn to be those new people together, or if the war had changed them too much to find their way back to each other. But looking at Sarah as she served lunch to a table of young pilots, seeing the grace and strength in every movement, James felt something like hope stirring in his chest. They'd survived the war apart. Surely they could survive the peace together. The restaurant James chose was Mario's Italian on the edge of town, a small family-owned place with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. It wasn't fancy, but it was nicer than anywhere they'd been able to afford before the war. And after months of boarding house meals and canteen food, Sarah's eyes lit up when they walked through the door. "James, this is too much," she protested as the owner, old Mr. DeLuca, showed them to a corner table near the window. "It's not enough," James said, pulling out her chair. "Not nearly enough." They ordered chicken parmesan and spaghetti, shared a bottle of red wine that Mr. DeLuca insisted was on the house. "For our boys who came home," he said, his eyes misty, and for the first time since James had returned, they talked, really talked. Not about the canteen or the war or the house or money, but about smaller things, memories. The way Mrs. Peterson's cat used to terrorize their vegetable garden. The summer they'd gone to the county fair and James had won Sarah a stuffed bear at the ring toss. The night he'd proposed, stumbling over his words on her parents' porch while fireflies danced in the darkness. "I still have that bear," Sarah said, twirling spaghetti on her fork, "packed away in my suitcase at the boarding house. I couldn't leave it behind when I had to give up the house." "We'll get the house back," James said. "I don't know how yet, but we will." Sarah looked at him across the candlelight, her expression soft but serious. "Maybe we don't need to. Maybe we need something new. A fresh start without all the old memories haunting us. You don't mean that, don't I?" She set down her fork, choosing her words carefully. "That house was the place I waited for you, James. The place where every day I wondered if you were dead or alive. The place where I got the telegram about your injury and thought my heart would stop. The place I had to leave because I couldn't afford to keep it, couldn't bear to stay there alone one more night. Maybe we need somewhere without all that pain attached to it." James hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been so focused on reclaiming what they'd lost, rebuilding what the war had broken, that he hadn't considered Sarah might not want to go back, might need not to go back. "Then we'll find something new," he said. "Wherever you want, we'll build new memories, better ones." "I'd like that." Sarah smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I'd like that very much." They finished dinner as the evening shadows lengthened, then walked slowly back toward the boarding house. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of wood smoke from chimneys and fallen leaves from the trees lining Main Street. Millbrook was settling into its evening rhythms. Families visible through lit windows, the sound of radios playing, a few couples strolling hand in hand. Normal life, peaceful life, the life James had fought to preserve. "There's something I need to show you," Sarah said as they walked. "Something I should have shown you already." They turned down a side street James didn't recognize, past the Lutheran church and the elementary school where Sarah used to teach, until they reached a small park with a memorial statue in its center. A bronze soldier, rifle slung over his shoulder, looking toward the horizon. Names were engraved on the base, James saw as they drew closer, names of Millbrook men who hadn't come home. But Sarah wasn't leading him to the memorial. She was heading toward a bench at the far edge of the park, beneath a large oak tree that still held most of its leaves despite the season. "I came here," Sarah said, sitting down on the bench. "When things got too hard, when the fear got too heavy, I'd come here and sit, sometimes for hours." James sat beside her, waiting. "I'd imagine you sitting next to me," Sarah continued, her voice distant, remembering. "I'd have whole conversations with you in my head, tell you about my day, about the soldiers at the canteen, about Mrs. Henderson's latest care package drive. I'd tell you about how scared I was, how tired, how sometimes I wasn't sure I could keep going." She turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And then I'd imagine what you'd say back. You'd tell me to be strong, to keep faith, to remember that every day I survived was one day closer to you coming home. And somehow that would be enough to get me through to the next day and the next, until weeks turned into months, and months turned into a year and more." James felt his throat tighten. "I wish I'd been here, really here, not just in your imagination. But you were here," Sarah said softly. "Not physically, but you were here. Every choice I made, every sacrifice, every hour I worked at the canteen, it was all for you, all to keep myself connected to you, to keep believing that someday we'd sit on this bench together for real, not just in my head." James pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky, the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, mournful and long. "I talked to Mrs. Henderson more this afternoon," Sarah said eventually, "after you left to find us a dinner reservation. She offered me a position, a real position, not just serving in the canteen." "What kind of position?" "Coordination director for the veteran relief programs." Sarah's voice carried a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "They're expecting thousands of men to come home over the next few months as the war winds down. Those men are going to need help, finding jobs, adjusting to civilian life, dealing with injuries, physical and emotional. Mrs. Henderson wants to create a program to help them, and she wants me to run it." James pulled back slightly to look at her face. That's incredible, Sarah. You'd be perfect for it. But it would mean I'd still be working at the base, still be around all those soldiers." She searched his face. "Would that bother you? After everything that happened when you first came home, after what you thought when you saw me there?" James thought about his answer carefully. 2 days ago, even 1 day ago, he might have said yes. Might have let his pride and his jealousy and his own insecurity push him to ask her to give it up, to come home, to be the wife he'd imagined rather than the woman she'd become. But that would have been wrong. He saw that now. "You should take it," he said firmly. "You found something you're good at, something that matters. Why would I ask you to give that up?" "Because you're my husband. Because we should be building a life together, not separately." "We will be building a life together," James said. "But that doesn't mean we have to do everything together. You have your calling, helping those men adjust and survive, and I'll find mine. Maybe I'll use my GI Bill benefits to go back to school, learn a trade. Maybe I'll work with my hands, build things. I always liked carpentry. We'll figure it out together. even if we're working toward the same goal from different directions." Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her tired face into something beautiful and young and full of hope. "You really mean that? You're not just saying it?" "I mean it." James kissed her forehead. "I spent 3 years fighting fascism overseas. The least I can do is spend the peace supporting my wife while she fights to help the men who fought beside me. It's important work, Sarah. Maybe the most important work there is right now." "Thank you." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for understanding, for seeing me, really seeing me, instead of just seeing who you expected me to be." They sat there on the bench beneath the oak tree as full darkness settled over Millbrook, as the stars came out one by one overhead, as the town around them quieted into sleep. And James thought about all the things he'd learned in the past 2 days, all the ways his understanding had shifted and deepened. He'd come home expecting to find his life waiting for him, unchanged and preserved like something in a museum. Instead, he'd found something more complicated, more difficult, and ultimately more real. He'd found a wife who'd fought her own war, made her own sacrifices, become her own kind of hero. He'd found a woman who was stronger than he'd imagined, braver than he'd known, more remarkable than he'd given her credit for, and he'd found that love, real love, lasting love, wasn't about 2 people staying exactly the same. It was about 2 people growing and changing and choosing each other anyway, over and over again, through all the transformations life demanded. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked quietly. "I'm thinking about a story my chaplain told me once back in France," James said, "about how the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fires. How pressure and heat and stress don't break metal, they make it stronger, more resilient, more valuable. Is that what we are? Forged steel?" "Maybe," James smiled. "Or maybe we're just 2 people who survived hell and came out the other side still holding on to each other. Either way, I'll take it." Sarah lifted her head to look at him. "I love you, James Crawford. I loved you when you left. I loved you while you were gone. And I love you now that you're home. That never changed, even when everything else did." "I love you too," James said. "And I promise you from here on out, no more doubts, no more jealousy. No more assuming the worst. Just trust, faith, and whatever comes next, we face it together." "Together," Sarah echoed. They kissed there beneath the oak tree, sealing the promise, and James felt something settle in his chest, something like peace, something like home. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew. They'd have to find a new place to live, figure out their finances, navigate the strange new world of peacetime after years of war. They'd both have scars, his visible on his leg, hers invisible but no less real, and those scars would take time to heal, but they'd survived the worst. Surely they could handle whatever came next. 3 months later, on a cold January morning in 1946, James stood in front of a small house on Elm Street, keys in his hand. It wasn't their old house. That had been sold to pay off debts they couldn't manage. But it was theirs, purchased with his discharge pay, Sarah's savings, and a small veteran's loan. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window overlooking a backyard, perfect for a garden, and a front porch where they could sit on summer evenings. A fresh start. New memories waiting to be made. Sarah came up beside him, linking her arm through his. "Well, should we go in? Together?" James asked, smiling. "Always together," Sarah confirmed. They walked up the steps and through the door into their future, leaving the war behind them at last. And as James closed the door on the cold January day, he thought about all the couples like them across America. Soldiers and their sweethearts, veterans and their wives, all of them trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by war. All of them learning to love each other again in the aftermath of unimaginable loss and change. Some would make it, some wouldn't. The war had broken too many things, hurt too many people, created too many unbridgeable gaps, but James and Sarah would make it. He was sure of that now, because real love, the kind that lasted, wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about unchanged devotion or untested faith. It was about two imperfect people seeing each other fully, scars and changes and all, and choosing love anyway, choosing forgiveness, choosing trust, choosing every single day to build something new from the rubble of what was lost. And that, James thought as he watched Sarah move through their new home, her face bright with plans and possibilities, was the real victory. Not just surviving the war, but surviving everything that came after, together. If this story reminded you of the quiet strength of those who waited and worried, leave a comment honoring a military spouse you know, past or present. These unsung heroes kept the home fires burning, held families together, and showed us that courage isn't just found on the battlefield. It's found in the everyday sacrifices of those who love someone in uniform. The greatest generation gave us everything, the soldiers who fought and the families who waited. Let's never forget either sacrifice. Subscribe for more true stories that honor the hearts, the homes, and the hopes that kept America strong when darkness threatened to consume the world. Because every veteran has a story, and every military spouse does too. Their love was tested by war. Their faith was tested by distance. Their marriage was tested by fear and misunderstanding. But in the end, love proved stronger than doubt. Trust proved stronger than jealousy, and together proved stronger than apart. That's the real story of the greatest generation. Not just how they won the war, but how they won the peace. One marriage, one family, one quiet act of courage at a time. Welcome home, heroes. All of you.